great famine, not unlike that which affected Israel during the Midianite oppression, as noted in the book of Judges. The internal evidence would place the time setting at about 1200 BC, and this was long before the united monarchy under King Saul or King David. The book has often been linked, actually, with the book of Judges, and some think that common writers used the book along with the book of Judges, or edited it. Certainly later on we'll see that it was edited at a later date. But it provides a glimpse into the activities and the customs of that period, which is quite interesting. You'll find out when we read this story today that there's a lot of customs that were done during those days that we don't do today, and you might find them a little odd or rather strange, but that's the way they did things back then, and we'll see a little bit of why. But even in the time of famine and perhaps great adversity, the book or the story emphasizes the sovereign activity of God and his providential working in the affairs of man, even though man oftentimes is completely oblivious to the fact that God's hand is in your life or theirs. As we go through this story, I would like for you to see if you can pick out the elements where God moved the events to fulfill his plan and work in the lives of these people. The story I'm going to pick up today is the book of Ruth. In Ruth, the first chapter, I'd like to go there if you would. Give you a little bit. This story could be put in a movie, and probably has been and will be. It is like the greatest script that you ever read, the simplest short story, if you want to call it that was written, and it really has several sections in here. It's like it has a background. It has the introduction of the characters. It has the thickening of the plot, and then, of course, it has the climax at the very end of the show or the movie or the script that we read here today. In verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled," and of course, as I said, puts this in the context right there close to the book of Judges. It tells us this is during the time of the judges, so the timing and the time setting there, the writers or the commentaries agree that this is very early, probably around 1200 BC. And there was a famine in the land. This was, as I said, not uncommon. You remember we read about the famine in the days of Gideon during the Judges. Whether this was the same one or another one that happened, some of the ancient scholars of the Targum write that there were 10 different famines throughout history. There was one in the very earliest days, and then one in Abraham's day, and in Isaac's day, and in Jacob's day, and then some of the prophets' days, and there's one yet to come in the future. Eventually it'll be the 10th one. And he says, "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So these were Israelites that went across the Dead Sea, on the eastern shores of the Dead Sea, where the land of Moab exists. Now, Moab, as I said, is situated on the eastern border of the Dead Sea. And if you remember, Moab was the son of Lot. And you remember that was sort of a weird way he came about. It was an incestuous relationship between his son, between his daughters, because they thought the whole world had been destroyed and they were the only living human beings. And so Lot's 2 daughters got him drunk one night, and as a result, Moab came into being. And he's the father of the Moabites. But even, and there's other occasions that we read about the Moabites. You remember Balak, who joined with the Midianites in hiring Balaam to curse Israel. You remember that story. And then there was another king, Eglon, who oppressed Israel also during the time of the judges. And you remember during Gideon's day, there was a famine, and when they would go out to harvest their crops and they would be by the threshing floor, the Midianites would come and take all of their crops and leave them. So they had to hide out, remember, in those days to try to harvest their grains very carefully. Let's pick up the story. And the name of the man, he and his wife and his 2 sons, and the name of the man was Elimelech. And that name there, by the way, means God is my king. So this man was a believer in God. He was, an Israelite that followed all the laws of Moses. And the name of his wife, Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon, Mahlon, and Chilion, 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 maybe that's how you pronounce that. Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they came into the country of the Moab and continued there. They dwelt there. They moved out. Because of the famine, they were trying to find in Moab, the land of Moab, you would think is sort of a plain desert area, but there are little mountains and rifts and valleys and places that they could grow vegetation, where they could have crops and they could have animals. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So she's a widow. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. Time out. We know that the book of Moses forbid them to marry of the tribe of Moab. That was an absolute strict forbidding of marrying them. So here we have the first incident where these men kind of went out on their own. They married these foreign women, and it was against the policies or against the laws that God had given the nation of Israel. And the name of the one was Orpah, and the other one was Ruth, and they dwelt therein 10 years. So a lot of time goes by, a whole decade, 10 years. I wish I had the last 10 years back in my life, don't you? I mean, how fast has that 10 years gone by? I wish I had that time back, because now I'm on the wrong side of 40 and on the wrong side of 50 and the wrong side of 60. And 10 years means a whole lot more to me than it did when I was 20, because I had all this time out in front of me that forever my life is going to go on, and I'm going to have all the time in the world. And these old people, you know, that I'm rooting and bumping out of the way and are in my way all the time, you know, I'll never be that. You know, and now here I am, the slowpoke on the highway. And Mahlon and Chilion died, and also both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So some of the commentaries say that, was this a result of their disobedience to God that they went out and married these foreign women? And it's a possibility, I guess. Then she arose with her daughter-in-law, and they might return to the country of Moab, from the country of Moab, so they wanted to go back home. And I'll go through this a little bit quickly here. She realized that the people of God there in Bethlehem, Judah, were still being blessed, and she decided to go back. And she returned to the land of Judah, and on her way, she told her daughter-in-laws, look, I don't have any more sons. You know, it was the right or the laws of God that had given them, if a son dies, that his wife was to marry her brother so that the name would continue and on down. And if they did get married and had children, they would be called by the sons of the dead person, the dead husband. And so that name in Israel would not be stamped out because of the death of a husband or a son. But here in this case, she had no sons to fulfill that obligation, nor was she pregnant, because look down in verse Looks down in verse 11. And Naomi turned again to my daughters. Why will you go with me? And is there any more sons in my womb? So that tells her that she's not pregnant now, and that they may be your husbands. Turn again, my daughters, go your way. I'm too old to have a husband. So she's an elderly woman. She's not pregnant. There's no chance that she's going to have a child, a son. And even if she did, it would be, 18 years before they would be able to, marry these ladies. And so she sends them away. Down in verse 14, and they lift up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and she left. But Ruth clave unto her mother-in-law. That's interesting to me. And she says in verse 15, behold, your son-in-law is gone back unto her people and her gods, or your sister-in-law is gone back to her people and unto her gods. That's interesting. These weren't converted wives, daughters-in-laws. They were still pagan. They still worshiped their pagan gods to some degree, including Ruth, I believe. And she returned. But look what Ruth says in verse 16. Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after you. For whether you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. What a statement. Jesus made a statement like that where he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. She's essentially saying this, and not only is that is she making this choice to abandon both her family, her people, her country, and her faith to go with Naomi. I want you to think about as we go through the story what that choice meant. Not only for her family immediately, but for her lineage that would follow. And for all of mankind, as we shall see. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. It's like we're going to be buried side by side. I mean, I'm going with you all the way to the grave. The Lord do so to me, even more, but death part thee and me. In other words, until death do we part, She's basically saying that. And I like to think some of the commentaries sort of introduce some of the conversation maybe that might have gone between these two ladies. She says, you can't go back with me because we keep the Sabbath days and the holy days. We have laws about things we can eat. We observe one God. And the conversation between these two ladies must have been such that the lady said, I don't care. Your God is going to be my God. And there are consequences for doing things in our custom back home that could get you killed. And she says, whatever your God requires of me, that is what I'm going to do. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, she left speaking, and the two went, and they came to Bethlehem. Now, I wrote the word Bethlehem out in my margin and put a circle around it, because to me, I think this is divine providence. Now, you could say, Elimelech had some land back in Bethlehem and she's going home. We'll see that she actually does have some property back there, and that was home to her husband who had died. But I think it's a reason that she's in Bethlehem, because we know what the city of Bethlehem, the role it would play later in history. And it came to pass that they came to Bethlehem, and all the city was moved, and they was wondering, hey, Naomi's home. She's been gone for 10 years, and she's returned. And she said, don't call me Naomi anymore, because that means pleasant, happy. I want you to call me Mara, which means bitter, because God has dealt very bitterly with me. After all, her husband had died and both of her sons. Mara, you remember, that's what they called the water where the Israelites drank from, and it was bitter. So they called the place Mara, and they complained before God, and God almost destroyed them all because of it. That's another place that word is mentioned. And she said unto them, call me not Naomi, but Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. And I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. So Naomi returned and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which is returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. I wrote in my margin here, harvest, and circled it. Is it any wonder, or is it by chance that it was springtime, and it was during the time of the barley? What happened during the barley harvest? We know that was early spring. That was during the days of the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, when the priest would go out and chop down a sheaf offering and present it before God. That we know later represented Jesus Christ being offered. They show up on the very days during that time. I don't think it's by accident, in my opinion. Down in verse... So we go into chapter 2, and Naomi and the kinsman of her husband's a mighty man of wealth, and the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. So we introduce the characters here in chapter 2. We find out that Boaz, who is we don't know if he's a cousin or brother or uncle, rich uncle of Elimelech, but in chapter 2 it introduces him. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me go out to the field and glean the ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. She doesn't know where she's going. She didn't know anything about Boaz. And this was the custom in Israel that, you remember in the, I think it's in the book of Deuteronomy, it says when you go out and harvest the field, you're not to gather every grain of corn or whatever grain you might have, barley. You're to leave some of it for the poor. They were to be allowed to go back later, and after the harvesting was done, and and picked the corners, and whatever was left, that was for the poor people. I read an article this morning where how King Henry VIII, this got so rampant in England that he outlawed the gleaning of the fields by anyone other than the landowners. And I believe it was because the landowners were probably being taken advantage of. I mean, can you imagine a crop or a gardener, a big farm today, having all of these crops out in a field, and everybody could just go out and harvest them? Well, the guys would be overwhelmed with people today of going and getting their free crops, wouldn't they? So some sort of limitation had to be. It was only meant for the poor. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said unto Naomi, let me go to the field. And of course, and she came to the gleaning of the field after the reapers. And it just so happened that she was to light on a part of the field belonging to Boaz. And again, I wrote in my margin here, it just happened. You think God had something to do with this? What I gleaned from that, no pun intended, is that I wonder if things happen today that are in God's hand to guide and direct our lives according to His will that we are completely unaware. I like to think that does happen. She came up on this field that was Moab, for he was a kindred of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, so he was gone. He's like the ruler over this estate, and he's probably got guys out in the field that are supervisors, and they're harvesting, and they would go along, the reapers would go along with their sickles, sharpened sickles, and reap, and then they would gather these up, and usually young people and maidens would gather these up in bundles, and somebody would tie up these sheaves, and then others would load them on wagons, and they would carry them, and then they would go to the threshing floor where they would beat this barley, and the grains would come off the stalks, and they would throw the remnants away, the chaff as it's called, and they would gather up all of this barley grain and store it. And he came along and he said, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, said, the Lord bless you. By the way, that term there is Jehovah. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord be with you. That's the way they greeted one another in those days. I like that. And then said Boaz unto his servants that was over his reapers, who's that girl? I wrote here in my margin, you suppose she was attractive? I mean, he had a lot of maidens out there working in the field, and all of a sudden this gal walks up, and he's like, who's she? And how old was Boaz, by the way? It seems to indicate he was up in years. I mean, he was older man, maybe middle age, I don't know. And the servant that was set over the reapers answered, that's the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And he said, I pray you, let me. And she said, let me glean in the field. And we let her glean. And then said Boaz unto Ruth, then in verse 8, hear thou not, my daughter, don't go glean in another field. And I wrote another question here in my notes. Did Boaz know who Naomi was? Yes, he did. Did he make that known to her at this moment? No, to Ruth. He didn't say anything about Naomi is my kinsman's wife, ex-wife, before he died. He didn't say any of that. He just left it a mystery, left it sort of vague. Just told her, said, don't go bothering any other fields. You come here and glean here. And let your eyes be on this field that when they reap. And down in verse 10, and she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said to them, why have I found grace in your eyes? I love that. And I believe Boaz saw this humility that she had, this really lowly attitude that she had, that you should take knowledge of me, seeing I'm a stranger. He could have said, you're a pagan foreign lady, so we'll have nothing to do with you, but he took her in. And Boaz answered and said, it has fully been showed me all that you have done unto your mother-in-law since her death, and of her husband, and the death of your father and mother, and how you have left father and mother and land and nativity, and are coming to a people which you didn't even know. I think Boaz said, here's a lady who took care of her elderly mother-in-law. She could have stayed home And yet she came all the way back here. She's taking care of this mother-in-law, elderly mother-in-law. She gave up everything she owned, everything that was her history, her past, to come here and not only take care of her, but now she's out here trying to gather grain for their support. And I think he appreciated that, and he said, "May the Lord recompense your work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord your God, the God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust." He recognized, I believe he recognized her sacrifice. And he said, "I can reward you some, but it's not enough of what you really deserve because of your character and all the things that you're doing and your efforts." And she said, "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto your handmaiden, though I be not like unto one of your handmaidens." And Boaz said unto her, "At mealtime you come and dip your bread in the..." So when the crew breaks for dinner, you come into this tent, you can take your bread, dip it in the vinegar, and you can share a meal here with these reapers, just like one of them. And I like to think that she helped out, don't you? Even though she was there just to reap, maybe she pitched in to help with the work and did what she could. "And when she had risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men," I like this, verse 15, probably my favorite scripture in the whole story. "Let her glean among the sheaves," not the corners of the field, not what's left over in the field. When they get through harvesting it all and it's all stacked over here in the corner, they said, "Let her go over there and glean among the sheaves, and reproach her not, and let some of the handfuls of purpose fall for her, and leave them that she may glean them, and rebuke her not." So you're actually to spill a little bit unintentionally or intentionally so that she'll have some to pick up. I like Boaz. I like the man, don't you? I like his heart. I like what he saw in her, and I like the way that he's treating her. "So she gleaned in the field into the evening, and beat out that she'd gleaned, and she had about a half a bushel, and she carried it home to her mother. And her mother said, 'Where did you glean today, and what wrought thou?' And she said, 'Blessed be he that did take knowledge of you.'" This is Naomi talking down at verse 19. She didn't even know where Ruth had gone. "And Naomi said unto her, Blessed be he, the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is near of kin unto us, one of our kinsmen." Because Ruth had told her that it was Boaz's field that I went in. She goes, "Oh, that's the rich uncle," or whatever he was, whatever relationship he was with Elimelech. Probably didn't have a really close relationship because it's like they didn't even talk to one another. But she said, "That guy is a near kinsman." And Ruth the Moabitess said, "He told me that, to stay fast to his field and to come eat dinner there." And so in verse 23, it says, "Boaz to glean an end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest." So they went all the way from the barley harvest to the wheat harvest. So 6 months goes by while all of this is going, and she's going out there gleaning in the field. And as I said, this is an introduction of the characters in this whole story. So we come to chapter 3, and I think this is the story, or this is the chapter where the plot thickens. In this chapter here, I guess, all of this 6 months is going by. And I think that of all this time that went by, Naomi is thinking about the future. She's elderly. She has this daughter-in-law, and she's worried about the future. She not only her future, but the future of Ruth. And so she devises a plan that would ensure the security of her family. And she provided an opportunity that would move things along. So she wasn't waiting for the opportunity to happen. She was going to make it happen in a sort of a way, a sort of matchmaking, if you will. I've seen that happen, and I don't know. Sometimes I think it's a little presumptuous, but at other times maybe it's appropriate. But in a very delicate way, she does this with the complete humility and subjection of Ruth that might gain the attention of Boaz. And if you want to call this a romantic story, I guess it is. I think it is. She says, my daughter, in verse 1, shall I not seek rest for thee that it may be well with you? I'm elderly. I need to start making plans for you. And now is not Boaz our kindred, whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnows barley tonight in the threshing floor. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint you, and put on your best garments. Put on the nicest clothes you have, and get thee down to the floor. Make not thyself known unto the man until he has had his supper. He's finished his day's work, and he's relaxing in the evening. And it shall be that when he lies down, and you shall mark the place where he lies, and you shall go in and uncover his feet and lay down there, and he will tell thee what you shall do. So she's going to go in where he's reclining. He's got his covers pulled over him, and he's laying there asleep at the end of a pile of grain after a long day's work of all of his servants. He's probably exhausted. He's had his meal, and she goes in and uncovers the covers and sort of crawls in and snuggles down at his feet. And it shall be that when he lies down, you shall mark the place. And she said unto her, all that you say unto me I will do. And she went down unto the floor and did according to all of her mother-in-law bade. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went and lay down at the end of the heap of corn. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid her down. And it came to pass at midnight, the guy doesn't even know she's there, and he wakes up and there's a human being at his feet, and he jumps up out of bed like I did last night when the lightning struck. And it says he was startled and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. I think some of the commentators say he was like Joseph was when, you remember when the lady tried to entrap him, when he was in Egypt, Potiphar's wife, he dropped his robe and took off running. I mean, he was ready to get out of there because he knew he didn't want to get in that situation with her. And there's other cases of that in the Bible. And he said, who are you? And she said, I'm Ruth, your handmaiden. Spread, therefore, your skirt over your handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. Now, without being too graphic here, and don't let your mind get away from you here, the custom was that a near kinsman had the right of redemption, and he was a near kinsman. So essentially, what she's not just, throwing herself at him, she's saying, make me your wife, because we have the right to do that because you're a near of kinsman. And so he said, blessed be the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast shown more kindness in the latter end than in the beginning. I have struggled with this scripture a little bit, and I said, what does Boaz mean by that? You're more kind now than when you first arrived. And what he's essentially saying is all of the kindness that you were showing Naomi is nothing like what you're doing now, because now you're not even concerned about your own benefit or your own survival. You're trying to uphold the family name of your lost husband. And he thought she'd hung the moon. She wasn't even concerned at this moment about her own survival. She was concerned about her husband's name being upheld. Now remember, she's a Gentile. And yet she's clung to the laws of Israel and God about this right of redemption. I want to read here just a little bit of some of this that I wrote about a near kinsman. The word is goel in the Hebrew, and it means he had the responsibility to redeem property, including people, that was lost or was about to be lost in a sale. They had the right to buy the old home place or buy the land or the people. He had the right to avenge blood of a family member, of a murderer. The murderer could flee to one of these cities of refuge, but if he came out of that city, the kinsman had the right to take vengeance upon him, justice. He was obliged to marry a widow of a deceased near relative so that to raise up children to the name of the dead, and so their name would continue, as I said. And not only that, they had this custom, and it sort of seems strange to us today, but when they made this agreement to marry the lady whose husband had died, they would take their shoe off. The lady would take the shoe off and give it to the person to whom she belonged. And it was sort of like a sign of a covenant. If he refused to buy her, she would spit in his face. And he would be considered an outcast, sort of like an outcast, because he didn't fulfill his obligation as this redeemer. We'll see in the case here with Boaz that she doesn't spit in his face, thankfully. Let's continue here. He says, I see that you are a virtuous woman, and now it is true, I am a near kinsman, howbeit there's a kinsman nearer than I. I'm not the closest kinsman to you. And he said, tarry here this night, and it shall be in the morning that he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman. Well, let him do the kinsman part, but if he doesn't do the kinsman part, then will I do the part of the kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth, lie down until the morning. And he told her to get up, leave here early in the morning so nobody sees that you were here, so nobody will think any bad thoughts about you, that you were here all night. And of course they did that. And he loads her up the next day. He tells her to come in there with her veil and stretch it out. He puts all this like 6 bushels worth of grain, a load for a woman to be carrying anyway, and sends her home with this, I guess, this second part of this story, which I think is really grand, is what Naomi says when she gets home. And she goes, where did all this stuff come from? And she said, he gave this all to me. And she said, lady, look, I want you to read this in verse 18 because this is good stuff. He gave me all this barley and said, don't go empty to your mother-in-law. In verse 18, then she said, this is Naomi now talking to Ruth. Sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man will not be in rest until he has finished the thing this day. I love this because the mother-in-law said, aha, it worked. And this guy's in love, and he's not going to have any sleep come to his eye until he finds out whether he can have you as his wife. So she must have been wringing her hands and thinking, man, this is good stuff. My daughter-in-law has got a chance of finding this wealthy guy. I mean, it's a great novel if you think about it. So we come to chapter 4, which I believe is the climax of the story. Then Boaz went up the gate and sat down there, and behold, the kinsman of Boaz came in. They don't even tell him his name. He's not even important enough to know his name. They come to the gate, which all business transactions, I love what one of the commentaries said. If we'd had this in modern time, we'd have had to have a whole string of lawyers. We'd have had to have several judges. We'd have had to have about 2 or 3 or 6 weeks of preparation. Naomi or Ruth would have never gotten married as a result of that. It would have went on for months. But they came to the city gates, and he says, he calls out this guy when he walks into the gate and tells him to sit down. He gathers up 10 witnesses, and they're all there to witness the transaction. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and sit down here. And he says, and he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, that is come again out of the country of Moab, sells a parcel of land which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought to advertise to thee, buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, then tell me that I may know, for there is none to redeem it besides you, and I am after you. And the guy says, then I'll buy it. I'll buy her. I'll buy Naomi. And my heart sort of takes a beat there when I read that in this story. I wrote that, my heart sinks here a little bit. He had the right to buy the land, and he had the right and the responsibility to redeem Naomi. And he had to buy Ruth, and he didn't know that. And Boaz said, what day you buy the field at the hand of Naomi, you must buy also Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up a name of the dead upon his inheritance. And that was, remember, Mahlon, M-A-H-L-O-N. I spelled it for you. And the guy says, I can't redeem it. Like I said, there was a little bit of stigma of refusing to buy. He said, and this was a little bit confusing here, this scripture. He is, I can't buy it lest I mar my own inheritance and redeem thou my right to myself. I cannot redeem it. I read one of the commentaries that said he already had a wife. He already had a son. And when he found out that he could buy the land and get this old lady, everything was great. But when he found out about Ruth, now he had the responsibility of making her his wife and having a son who would grow up and do what? Inherit the land. So he would lose it all eventually. All of this would interfere with his own family, I think. and respectfully, and I think this was done a little bit different than someone just absolutely refusing to help someone. The circumstances were there was someone else here that could take that responsibility, and he did. So now was the manner of the time of Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing or exchanging to conform to all things. A man may pluck off his shoe and give it to his neighbor, and this was the testimony in Israel, and so they did that. She drew off his shoe, and Boaz said to the elders and all the people, and to me, I wrote in my margin here, this for her was the day of redemption. He says, you are witnesses this day that I have brought all that was, I bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife. I could jump up and down at this. I could just see the smile on his face when he said that. To raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his place. You are witnesses this day. And all the people that were in the gates and the elders said, we are witnesses. They testified, and they sort of went out and said, blessed be this woman who was like, some of the ancient mothers in Israel, and blessed be her, that she might be also famous in Israel, that she may be. And he said unto thee, a restorer of your life and a nourisher of your old age, and your daughter-in-law, which loves thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons. No sons could have given you what she has given you. And the woman, her neighbors, gave her the name. She had a child in her bosom and nursed it, and they named the child Obed. When you go back and look at the history of the nation of David, or the heritage of David, and the heritage of Jesus Christ, Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. So this was the great-grandfather of David. And it was by a Israelitish father and a pagan mother. I mean, not pagan, but a foreign woman that was allowed. The book of Deuteronomy says that they weren't to give themselves over to these pagan gods, but they allowed her to be brought into Judah, and it was allowed to be a proselyte, if you will, and a convert, which he certainly was. And it tells us down here in verse 17, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now these are the generation of Pharez, Hezron, Ram, Abinadab, Nashon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, and then of course Jesse and David. And of course David was the father of Jesus Christ. I think that is a wonderful story. I wanted to go into the New Testament and talk about the bride of Christ and how Jesus sort of, it indicates in the New Testament how Jesus is like our Redeemer. And this was sort of a foreshadow of what Jesus would do for each of us. That he would provide, he would be like a kinsman redeemer, like an elder brother that redeemed us from the bondage of sin and from the things that overwhelm us in life oftentimes. He's there to meet our needs. His continuing love for the helpless mankind that is out here. He became rich. He was rich, but he became poor in order to empty himself and provide for his people. But I wanted to mention here before I close, and I'll just take a few more minutes here. To the married couple, we find instructions of personal morality. We find a genuine concern for the need of others, as well as a necessity for personal godliness in the face of testing and adversity, and that's certainly, they were going through that. To the woman, and I say this to the Christian woman, we find an example of virtues of godliness, purity, humility, honesty, fidelity, and certainly thoughtfulness. I think are exemplary standards for all Christian women in Ruth. To the men, I think when we look at the example of Boaz, to the Christian man, a model of God-given strength, of honor, of graciousness, of courtesy, and compassion that should be the high standard by which we all should live. And not only that, but would encourage other men to become believers. I like to finish by saying what Job said in the 19th chapter. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth.